The Appalachian Trail, a place of staggering beauty, and a place where the line between wilderness and oblivion is terrifyingly thin. This isn't just about getting lost. This is about how people disappear in the most baffling ways imaginable. They vanish from well-marked paths, sometimes just feet away from their companions, leaving behind everything: their gear, their food, their footprints. They are erased without a trace. Tonight, we delve into the cases that defy logic, the ones that leave investigators with no explanation. We'll confront the suffocating silence that falls just before an encounter with something ancient. We'll follow the ghostly whispers on a lonely trail that might explain one woman's disappearance. And we'll explore the terrifying possibility that for some who vanish on the Appalachian Mountains, the real mystery isn't if they'll be found, but what found them first. The old-timers in the hollers of Haywood County. They have a name for it. They call it the Dead Fall Silence. It's a quiet that settles in the deep woods of the Great Smoky Mountains. A quiet so profound, so absolute, it feels like the world is holding its breath. For 60-year-old Hank Thompson, a man who'd spent 35 years as a park ranger before retiring, a man who'd spent more of his life under a canopy of leaves than under a shingled roof, that silence was usually a familiar friend. It was the backdrop to his solitude, the canvas upon which the smaller sounds of the forest, the snap of a twig, the call of a distant owl painted a picture of life. But on that crisp October evening in 1987, the silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, suffocating. It felt like a presence in itself. Hank had set up his small, well-worn camp just off the Balsam Mountain Trail, in a secluded spot nestled in a grove of ancient hemlocks he'd used 100 times before. The sun was painting the autumn leaves in hues of gold and crimson, a sight that usually brought him a deep, abiding sense of peace. These mountains were his sanctuary, especially since Eleanor had passed 2 years prior. She had loved them so. They'd met when she was a tourist from the city, lost on a trail, and he'd been the young, handsome ranger who'd found her. They'd spent their honeymoon in a small cabin near Gatlinburg, and for the next 4 decades, these peaks and valleys had been the geography of their love story. Every trip back, for Hank, was a pilgrimage of sorts, a way to feel close to her, to hear her laugh in the bubbling of the creek. But tonight, an unease gnawed at him, a cold knot in the pit of his stomach that his hot coffee couldn't touch. The change had been gradual at first, so subtle he almost missed it. Around 4 in the afternoon, as the sun began its descent, he noticed the insects had stopped their chirping. A minor thing, perhaps a drop in temperature, but it was the first thread pulled from the tapestry of normal forest sounds. An hour later, as he was gathering firewood, he realized he hadn't seen a squirrel all afternoon. The usually chattering, belligerent creatures were gone. Then, as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, the birds fell silent. It wasn't their usual evening retreat into the trees, a slow fading of calls and songs. It was an abrupt cutoff, as if a switch had been flipped. One moment a thrush was singing its evening prayer, the next there was nothing. Even the constant, almost imperceptible rustle of leaves under the paws of unseen creatures had ceased. It was just Hank and the all-encompassing quiet. He built his fire a little higher than usual, the crackling flames a welcome, if small rebellion against the oppressive stillness. The firelight flickered against the massive trunks of the hemlocks, making them look like the pillars of some vast, dark cathedral. He thought about Eleanor. She used to say the trees were watching over them, benevolent giants. Tonight, that thought brought no comfort. They didn't feel benevolent. They felt like sentinels, guarding something ancient and terrible, something spoken of in hushed Cherokee legends he'd overheard as a boy about the Soul Kalu, the slant-eyed giants of the high peaks, spirits who did not suffer trespassers lightly. As a ranger, he dismissed such tales as folklore. Tonight, they felt chillingly real. As true darkness consumed the mountains, the silence deepened into something physical. Hank could feel it pressing in on him, a weight on his chest, a ringing in his ears as they strained for any sound at all. He sat by the fire on his favorite camp stool, his seasoned hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee, his knuckles white. He'd seen a lot in his years. Bears that had wandered through his camp, territorial mountain lions, even the fleeting, man-shaped shadow of what some of the old-timers called a Sasquatch. He'd faced them all with a steady hand and a healthy respect. But this was different. This was a feeling. A presence that had no form, no sound. He felt watched. Not by a predator in the traditional sense, but by something that was part of the very fabric of these mountains. An intelligence, ancient and aloof, had become aware of him. He scanned the impenetrable wall of trees that surrounded his small clearing, his eyes tracing the edge of the firelight, searching for the glint of eyes, the twitch of a shadow. He tried to dismiss it as an old man's nerves, a trick of the fading light and his own melancholy. Grief could play strange tricks on the mind, but the feeling persisted, a cold dread that seeped into his bones, a primal instinct honed over a lifetime in the wild, screaming that he was not alone, and that he was not welcome. He was an intrusion, an annoyance, and his presence was being considered. He added more wood to the fire, the flames leaping higher, casting long dancing shadows that played tricks on his eyes. A gnarled branch looked like a reaching arm, a mossy stump like a crouching figure. He knew it was his imagination, but the knowledge did little to quell the rising panic. Then, a twig snapped in the distance. The sound was so sharp, so loud in the oppressive silence, that it made him jump, sloshing hot coffee over his hand. He barely felt the sting. He grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against his pack, the cold steel a small comfort in his trembling hands. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice sounding small and fragile against the immense quiet. It was swallowed by the silence, leaving no echo. There was no answer, just the crackle of the fire and the unnerving, watchful stillness of the Sentinel woods. He waited, listening. Minutes stretched into an eternity. He thought he heard something else then, a low vibration, more felt than heard, that seemed to come from the ground itself. It was a deep, guttural hum that resonated in his chest, a sound that felt ancient and wrong. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the earth settling. It was something else. Then he saw it. Or he saw something. At the very edge of the firelight, where the darkness was deepest, a shape detached itself from the shadows between two massive oaks. It wasn't a bear. It was too tall, too lean. It stood on two legs, but its proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, hanging nearly to its knees, ending in hands that seemed too large. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace that defied its bulk, stepping from shadow to shadow without making a single sound, its feet seeming to find purchase on the leaf-strewn ground without disturbing a single leaf. Hank raised the rifle, his eye finding the sight, but his finger hesitated on the trigger. He couldn't get a clear look. It was a silhouette, a void in the darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. It wasn't just dark. It was a patch of absolute blackness, a hole in the fabric of the night. He felt a wave of cold dread wash over him that was colder than the autumn night. This wasn't a creature of flesh and blood. It was something else. The feeling of being watched intensified, but it wasn't just coming from the shape. It was coming from everywhere, from the trees, the rocks, the very air. The entire forest was a single malevolent entity, and he was a trespasser in its sacred heart. The shape took another silent step forward, and Hank's breath hitched in his throat. He couldn't shoot. Firing the rifle felt like a sacrilege, a futile act of defiance that would only provoke the inevitable. He felt a strange, calming suggestion enter his mind. It's nothing. Lower the gun. It's just a shadow, and he had to fight with all his will to keep the rifle raised. He stayed like that for what felt like hours, frozen, his rifle trained on the spot where the shape had been. It had melted back into the shadows as silently as it had appeared, but he knew it was still there. He could feel its patient, ancient gaze on him. He didn't dare sleep. He sat with his back pressed against a large, cold boulder, his rifle across his lap, watching the fire die down to glowing embers. The silence remained, a constant, crushing pressure. Dawn came not with the cheerful chorus of birds, but with a reluctant, gray light that filtered through the trees, making the world look washed out and dead, like a photograph left out in the sun. And with the light, the sounds returned. But they were muted, distant, as if coming from behind a thick pane of glass, a cheap imitation of what they should have been. Hank didn't wait to make coffee. He didn't bother to neatly pack his gear. He shoved everything into his pack with shaking hands, his eyes constantly scanning the trees around him, the back of his neck crawling. He just needed to leave. The hike out was a paranoid nightmare. Every shadow seemed to hold the tall, wrong-shaped figure. Every gust of wind through the skeletal branches sounded like a whispered threat. He didn't look back. Not once. He reached his truck by midday, his body aching, his mind reeling. He threw his pack in the back and drove away, the gravel spitting from his tires. He didn't stop until the Appalachian peaks were just a hazy blue line in his rearview mirror. Back in the small, quiet house that felt so empty without Eleanor, Hank found that the silence had followed him. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was the absence of the woods he had once loved. A week later, he sold his camping gear. All of it, the tent, the pack, the rifle. He couldn't bear to look at them. The mountains, his sanctuary, his connection to his lost love, were now a source of deep, unshakable terror. He could never go back. He started sleeping with the television on, the constant, meaningless chatter a flimsy shield against the memory of that heavy, watchful quiet. The absolute, profound silence of the Sentinel. Sarah Jenkins was no stranger to the Appalachian Trail. At 55, the retired librarian from Roanoke, Virginia, had hiked sections of it every year for the past decade. It was a ritual that marked the passage of seasons in her quiet, ordered life. She was methodical, cautious, always prepared. Her pack was a marvel of efficiency, every item in its place, every contingency planned for. She knew the trail's moods, its breathtaking beauty, and its sudden, unforgiving dangers. But Raven's Ravine, that was a place even the most experienced hikers spoke of in hushed tones. A treacherous, mist-shrouded section of the AT located deep in the George Washington National Forest, just south of the James River Footbridge. They said a ghost haunted the narrow path, the spirit of a young woman named Elara, who had vanished there during the Civil War, lost to the fog and a broken heart. Sarah was a practical woman. She'd spent her life surrounded by facts and verifiable histories, bound in leather and paper. She didn't believe in ghosts. But she also knew, from a lifetime of reading, that some places held a certain energy, a residue of the lives and emotions that had passed through them. As she stood at the trailhead marker on a cool afternoon in late September of 2012, she felt a familiar mix of anticipation and the gentle admonishment of her daughter, Jessica. "That place has a reputation, Mom," Jessica's voice echoed in her memory. "Old man Hemlock from the gear shop told me he saw a woman in white there once. Said it scared 10 years off his life." Sarah had just smiled, patting her daughter's hand. "Old man Hemlock also thinks Bigfoot steals his garden gnomes. I'll be fine. I'll call you when I'm through." She reached the heart of the ravine in the late afternoon. The trail narrowed here, hugging a steep cliff face that dropped sharply to a churning, rock-strewn creek below. The air grew cool and damp as the sun dipped below the ridge. A thick fog, common in the ravine, was rolling in, a writhing, gray mass that clung to the ancient moss-covered trees and dampened all sound. Sarah felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The usual forest sounds were absent here. There was only the rush of the creek below and the soft, almost silent drip of condensation from the leaves above. The stories she'd heard seemed to whisper on the wind. Tales of a heartbroken woman waiting for her Confederate soldier lover who never returned from the Battle of Cedar Creek in 1864. Sarah, a lover of history, knew the battle had been a devastating loss for the Confederacy in the Shenandoah Valley. A lot of young men from this area had never come home. Sarah pushed the thoughts from her mind and focused on the trail, which was becoming increasingly difficult to see in the swirling mist. Her world had shrunk to a few feet of rocky path. She paused to catch her breath, leaning against a damp rock wall. That's when she saw it, glinting dully in the dirt at her feet. It was a small, silver locket, heart-shaped and tarnished with age. The chain was broken. Acting on impulse, she picked it up. It was strangely cold to the touch, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to sap the warmth from her fingers, a cold that felt like a memory of winter. She tried to open it, but it was sealed shut with time and corrosion. A curious relic from a forgotten time, she thought, and slipped it into her pocket. Then she heard it, a faint, mournful cry that seemed to come from all around her, carried on the thick, wet air. It wasn't an animal. She knew the sounds of the forest intimately. This was human, a woman's voice, filled with a sorrow so profound, so utterly desolate. It felt like a sound that could tear at the very fabric of the world. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat, her heart beginning to pound a heavy, frightened rhythm against her ribs. The crying grew louder, closer. It was a sound of pure, unending grief, a sound that no living person should ever have to make. Through a sudden break in the fog, just ahead on the trail, she saw her. A young woman in a tattered, old-fashioned white dress, the fabric thin and clinging to her form, as if soaked with rain. Her long, dark hair was plastered to a face that was as pale and translucent as the mist itself. She was gliding, not walking, along the very edge of the ravine, her gaze fixed on the churning creek far below. She seemed unaware of Sarah, lost in her own eternal sorrow. Sarah's logical, librarian's mind screamed at her to run, that this was impossible, a hallucination brought on by fatigue and the power of suggestion. But her feet were rooted to the spot. She was mesmerized, held captive by the sheer weight of the apparition's despair. The woman turned, as if sensing Sarah's presence. Her eyes... Sarah would never forget those eyes. They were two pools of endless grief, of a loss so deep it had hollowed her out completely. They locked with Sarah's. In that instant, a wave of cold washed over Sarah, a cold that seemed to penetrate to her very soul. It was the cold of the locket, amplified 1,000 times. With the cold came a flash of images and emotions that weren't hers. The rough texture of a gray woolen soldier's uniform, the scent of pipe tobacco and pine, the crushing sense of betrayal upon hearing the news, the desperate, irrational hope that it was all a mistake, and finally, the dizzying, final sensation of an endless fall. The woman opened her mouth as if to speak, to share the burden of her story, but no sound came out. Her face contorted in a silent scream of agony, and then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she faded, dissolving back into the thick, swirling fog until nothing was left but the empty trail and the mournful sound of the wind. Sarah stood there for a long time, the only sound the frantic beating of her own heart and the rush of the water below. When she could finally move, she didn't continue forward. She turned and scrambled back the way she came, her careful, methodical pace forgotten. She stumbled on roots, her ankles turning on loose rocks, her only thought to get out of that place of sorrow. The fog seemed to fight her, to obscure the path, to hold her in its grasp. She finally broke free of the ravine as dusk was turning to night, emerging into the clearer air of the main trail. Gasping for breath, her clothes damp, her face streaked with tears she didn't remember shedding, she didn't stop to make camp. She hiked through the darkness, guided by her headlamp, a frantic energy propelling her forward. She reached her car in the early hours of the morning, exhausted and terrified. The first thing she did was call her daughter. Jessica knew immediately from her mother's trembling voice that something was wrong. "I'm okay," Sarah had said, the words feeling like a lie. I'm coming home." Back in her neat, quiet house in Roanoke, the world of facts and figures no longer felt so solid. The experience had shaken the very foundation of her reality. She couldn't shake the feeling of that penetrating cold, that shared, unbearable sorrow. Driven by a need to understand, she spent weeks in the local historical society's archives. Her librarian skills turned to a new, desperate purpose. She found it not in a newspaper, but in a dusty, leather-bound church registry from 1865. In the margins of the death records, a priest had made a note beside the name of a soldier, C.P.L. John Bishop. It read, "His betrothed, Gallara Vance, was lost to the mists of Raven's Ravine upon hearing this news. Her body was never recovered by this world. May God have mercy on her searching soul." Sarah's hands trembled as she read. She went home and, with a pair of small pliers, carefully pried open the locket she had found. Inside, faded but still legible, was a tiny, elegant engraving. The initial E. Sarah closed the locket with a soft click. She didn't sell it or throw it away. She placed it on the mantelpiece in her living room. She never hiked Raven's Ravine again. Her practical world was now haunted, not by a malevolent spirit, but by a profound sadness and by the certain, chilling knowledge that some stories, some parts of the old Appalachian mountains, are true. The silver locket on her mantel was her constant, cold reminder. For brothers Mark and David, exploring the labyrinth of limestone caves of the Appalachian Mountains was a tradition etched into their family's history. Their father, a geology professor at Virginia Tech, had first taken them to the Sinking Creek Caverns, a wild, undeveloped system near the Virginia Creeper Trail when they were boys in the late 1970s. He'd taught them how to read the rock, how to respect the deep, patient silence of the earth. Now, in their late 40s, on an unseasonably warm weekend in November of 2005, they were continuing the tradition. It was their way of staying connected to him, to the memory of his booming laugh echoing off the cavern walls. They were well-equipped, experienced cavers. Mark, the older brother at 48, was the cautious one. David, 5 years younger, was the adventurer, always pushing to go a little deeper. This time, something was different from the moment they approached the cave's mouth. A larger-than-usual cloud of bats streamed out as they neared, a frantic, leathery river against the afternoon sky. Inside, the air was unusually cold, a damp, stagnant chill that felt degrees lower than normal. And there was a strange, humming sound, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the rock itself, a bass note just on the edge of hearing. David dismissed it as an underground stream, but Mark, more sensitive to the cave's nuances, felt a prickle of unease. He pulled out their father's old, hand-drawn map, a beautiful, intricate document on yellowed drafting paper. He pointed to a section deep within the system. Their father had written a note there in his precise script. The serpent's spine, unstable. Air currents feel ... wrong. Sept. 78. Dad never went down this way, Mark said, his voice hushed. Dad was overly cautious, David countered with a grin. Come on, let's see what the old man missed. David's enthusiasm pulled a reluctant Mark along. They followed the narrow, winding passage. It opened into a vast, breathtaking cavern they had never seen. The ceiling was a cathedral of glittering stalactites. It should have been a moment of triumph. But the humming was louder here, a constant, monotonous thrum that made their teeth ache. And it was accompanied by something else, a faint whispering. At first, it was like static, a sibilant hiss that could have been the wind funneling through unseen passages. But as they stood in the center of the great cavern, the sound resolved itself. It was voices. A multitude of them, all speaking at once in a language they couldn't understand, a cascade of guttural clicks and soft, wet consonants. "What is that?" David whispered, his usual bravado gone, his voice tight. "I don't know," Mark replied, his hand resting on the hilt of the large knife on his belt. "Air pressure? Some kind of natural gas?" He was trying to rationalize it, but he knew this was not a natural phenomenon. The whispers seemed to be coming from a dark, gaping opening at the far end of the cavern, a black maw that seemed to swallow the light from their lamps. Curiosity and a foolish, primal need not to show fear urged them forward. As they approached, the whispering grew louder, the air colder. A sense of profound dread washed over them, a primal, animal fear that screamed at them to turn back. The air smelled of damp earth, ozone, and something else. Something metallic and unpleasant, like old blood. They stood at the edge of the dark passage, peering into the abyss. Their headlamps barely pierced the inky black. The whispers were all around them now, seeming to come from inside their own heads. And then they saw it, a flicker of movement deep within the darkness. Not an animal, not a human, something else. It was tall, impossibly thin, and moved with a jerky, unnatural gait. It stepped briefly into the edge of their light. Its skin was a pale, fish-belly white, almost translucent, and seemed to give off a faint, sickly bioluminescent glow. It had no discernible eyes, no features on its smooth, rounded head. Long, spindly limbs, ending in what looked like hooked claws, propelled it forward. Before they could process the horror, it retreated back into the impenetrable dark. But the image was burned into their minds, and in that moment, they had the terrifying realization that it had not been alone. They had felt a presence, a crowd of them, just beyond the light, watching from the darkness. The whispers stopped, the humming ceased, and in their place, there was only a profound, absolute silence. A silence that was somehow more terrifying than the sounds that had preceded it. It was the silence of a predator that has spotted its prey. They didn't speak. A shared telepathic terror passed between them. Mark grabbed David's arm, and they ran. Their flight was a chaotic, stumbling nightmare through the winding passages. They could hear sounds behind them now, not footsteps. A wet, skittering sound echoing through the passages from the walls and ceiling, impossibly fast. They didn't dare look back. They burst out of the cave mouth and into the late afternoon sun, blinking, gasping, covered in mud and a terror that was bone deep. The familiar green forest felt alien, a world away from the cold, whispering darkness they had just escaped. The drive home to Blacksburg was silent. The bond they had always shared was shattered. In the weeks that followed, the experience festered. David developed a severe claustrophobia, unable to even be in a small room without breaking into a cold sweat. Mark became obsessed, spending his nights poring over obscure folklore from the Clinch Mountain region, reading unsettling 19th century accounts from early settlers about pale crawlers and night-goers who were said to emerge from the earth after heavy rains. He found nothing concrete, only fragmented, terrified stories that mirrored their own. Their annual caving trip was never spoken of again. The Sinking Creek Caverns, their childhood sanctuary, had become a tomb of a shared, unspeakable memory. Sometimes, late at night, Mark will pull out his father's old map. His finger will trace the familiar passages, and then stop at his father's note. Air currents feel ... wrong. Mark now understood. It wasn't a geological observation. It was a warning. His father had felt something, knew something was down there, and had been wise enough to turn back. A choice Mark and David, in their own hubris, did not make. And he knows, with a certainty that chills him to his soul, that they are still down there in the cold, silent darkness of the Appalachian deep, waiting. Some mysteries are hidden in the wild, and many are never solved. Subscribe and witness the next true disappearance every other day.